Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. I hope you enjoy this story. Let us go. Robert was a man of routine. A creature of habit in the truest sense. Every day began and ended with the same rhythm. The commute down Mopac, the workday grind, the drive back to the suburbs, dinner, the couch, and then sleep. His life felt simple and predictable, like reruns of The Office that you could watch on an infinite loop, knowing exactly when the punchline was coming. He clung to this routine, considering it his anchor in a chaotic world. 16 years of marriage to Sarah had seen its share of peaks and valleys, but in his heart, Robert always believed they had the grit to weather any storm. Love did not have to be a fairy tale, he often mused. The main thing was to keep showing up. Today started like any other Tuesday in Austin. The morning coffee run, the endless Zoom calls, the clearing out of the inbox, everything was ticking along until around noon, when a sharp, jagged pain in his side brought him to a dead halt. Robert winced, pressing his hand against his ribs, trying to breathe through it, thinking it was just stress or maybe that breakfast burrito coming back to haunt him. But the pain did not fade. It sliced through his focus like a hot knife. His manager, seeing Robert doubled over at his desk, told him to pack it in. Go home, Rob. Sleep it off, his boss said, the concern genuine. Do not worry about the Q3 reports. Just get out of here. Robert left the air-conditioned office, feeling a wave of relief at the prospect of escaping the corporate hum for a few hours. All he could think about was crashing into his king-sized bed and sleeping until the sun went down. When he pulled into his driveway, his heart skipped a beat, and not in a good way. His eyes locked onto Michael's Ford F-150 parked right there on his concrete pad. It was not entirely unusual. Michael had been his best friend for nearly 20 years, closer than a brother, and he often dropped by unannounced. Robert knew Sarah always got a kick out of his visits. Still, something felt off. Maybe it was the stillness of the mid-afternoon, the way the Texas heat shimmered off the hood of the truck, or a sudden phantom chill in his chest that defied the 90-degree weather. Robert always prided himself on being a rational guy, a logic-driven man, and this feeling seemed irrational. But it was there, heavy and undeniable. Robert reached for the front door handle. Locked. Sarah never locked the deadbolt during the day, especially if someone was over. Robert's brow furrowed, confused, but he dug his keys out of his pocket and turned the lock. His footsteps echoed in the entryway, the house sounding too quiet, too empty. The air conditioning hummed, but underneath it, the atmosphere felt wrong, like the house itself was warning him to turn around and walk away. He kept walking, straining his ears against the silence. Then he heard it, a faint sound, the rustle of fabric, muffled voices drifting down the hall. Robert stopped dead in his tracks. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, his mind scrambling to come up with an innocent explanation, telling him he was crazy. But his gut knew the truth before his brain could process the data. Robert took a step forward, then another, moving slowly as if wading through molasses. The sounds grew distinct. Voices, moans. He realized this was not just a conversation. The noises were unmistakable, filled with an intimacy Robert never wanted to hear from behind that door. Seconds stretched into hours as he stood before the master bedroom. The brass handle felt ice-cold under his palm. Instead of throwing the door open in a rage, he froze, allowing himself one final second of ignorance before his reality shattered. Robert slowly pushed the door open. His gaze landed on the bed, and he felt something inside him violently tear apart. Sarah, his wife, was there. And right next to her, Michael. They froze the instant they saw him. Sarah, completely naked, was straddling Michael, their limbs tangled together, the color draining from their faces in an instant. For a heartbeat, Robert felt like a spectator in his own nightmare, like he was watching a scene from a movie happening to some other poor sap. He was paralyzed. Not a single word left Robert's lips. Images flashed through his mind like a slideshow on fast forward. 16 years of life, Sarah's laugh at their wedding, anniversary dinners on South Congress, hiking the Greenbelt together. It all felt like a fraudulent scheme. He squeezed his eyes shut, and suddenly the room exploded into motion. Sarah scrambled off Michael, frantically yanking the top sheet to cover herself, desperation written all over her. Michael practically rolled off the mattress, tripping over his own jeans on the hardwood floor. Robert, wait. Oh my God, wait. Sarah screamed, her voice shrill with panic but underscored by a chilling reality. Michael stood against the wall, silent, looking like a kicked dog, unable to meet his eyes. Robert looked at them, their pathetic, terrified faces, their clumsy movements. These were not the people he loved. They were strangers. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, but the words died in his throat. Instead of the volcanic rage that would have been logical, he felt a hollow, expansive emptiness. The only thing echoing in his skull was the dull thud of betrayal. Robert turned his back on them and walked out of the room without a sound. His legs carried him to the front door on autopilot, like he was in a trance. He opened it, walked out into the blinding afternoon sun without bothering to close the door behind him, and headed straight for his car. Not a word followed him. No apology could bridge that gap. The silence of the neighborhood was deafening. Robert slid behind the wheel and just sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the garage door, physically unable to initiate the next movement. Everything he knew, everything he had built, had collapsed in a single instant like a house of cards in a hurricane. Silence wrapped around him, but instead of internal chaos, he felt a cold, terrifying calm. Robert started the engine and drove away, having no idea where he was going or what the hell would happen next. Robert sat at the bar, absent-mindedly swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His stare was vacant, a 1,000-yard stare focused on the back of the bar, while his mind was a wreck. The bourbon was not helping. Not the first glass, not the second. Even the third shot of Maker's Mark could not numb the crushing weight pressing against his chest. The events of the last few hours refused to compute. The betrayal by Sarah and Michael, their helpless expressions, their pathetic attempts to cover up. It felt distant, like it had happened in a different timeline, and he was just watching the footage. "You look like you've been through the ringer, man," said Sam, the bartender, snapping Robert out of his daze. Robert looked up. He'd been coming to this dive for years, knew Sam well enough to talk sports, but he never unloaded his personal baggage. But tonight, the dam broke. The filter was gone. "It's all gone," Robert said quietly, his voice cracking. He felt the anger, previously buried under layers of shock, beginning to bubble up. It started as a low simmer but was quickly turning into a grease fire. Sam leaned over the bar, tossing a rag over his shoulder. He was a good listener, never pried, never judged, just poured. "Lay it on me," he said calmly, signaling he had time. Robert sighed, a heavy, shuddering breath, and started talking. He spilled everything, from seeing Michael's truck in the driveway to the moment he walked in on them in his own bed. When Robert finished, the bar seemed quieter than before. Even the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of the happy hour crowd seemed to fade into the background noise. Sam did not say anything immediately. He just looked at Robert with a grim nod of understanding. "So what's the play?" Sam finally asked. Robert raised his eyebrows, confused. "The play," he repeated, as if the concept was foreign. Sam wiped down the counter with a deliberate slow motion, then locked eyes with Robert. "You just gonna let them walk away clean?" The words hit Robert like a sledgehammer. The thought flashed in his mind, no. "No, I see, not just let them carry on like nothing happened." The flame of rage inside him roared to life. He did not have a map for this territory, but he knew one thing for sure, he was not going to be a doormat. "What are you suggesting?" Robert asked coldly, his gaze fixed on Sam. The bartender gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You know what they say, revenge is a dish best served cold. If you want to hit them, you gotta be smart about it. Think. Do not just react. Hit them where they are not looking." The advice sank into Robert's bones. He sat there, feeling his anger and agony transforming into something else, clarity. A plan. Sarah. Her job. Her career was her identity, her pride. She never shut up about her metrics, her achievements, how hard she ground for those promotions. "She has a massive presentation tomorrow," Robert said suddenly, almost to himself. A pitch to the C-suite. Sam raised an eyebrow, recognizing the shift in Robert's demeanor. "Well then," Sam said, "everyone's got a weak spot." Robert downed the rest of his bourbon, stood up abruptly, and headed for the door. He needed to move. The plan was already forming in his head. He drove home fast, his mind locked on one objective, find that pitch deck and do something she would never see coming. When he unlocked the front door, The house was silent as a tomb. Sarah was gone. Her work laptop, a sleek MacBook, was sitting on the kitchen island. Robert walked over to it, feeling zero hesitation. No guilt, just a strange, icy detachment. He flipped it open. She never logged out at home, and quickly located the file. It was the keynote for the client meeting she'd been stressing over for weeks. Robert opened the file and started scrolling through the slides. He knew he had to be surgical about this. It was not enough to just delete a file. IT could recover that in 5 minutes. He needed to plant a landmine that would not detonate until she was standing in front of the board. He started hunting for the perfect spot to insert the poison pill. After a few minutes of scrolling, he found the target, a crucial slide detailing strategic international partnerships. Robert hopped onto Google and found a few specific images and headlines, logos of companies currently under federal investigation for fraud and sanctions violations. They were subtle, professional-looking enough to pass a quick glance, but radioactive enough to destroy her credibility the moment they were projected on a 4K screen. It would make it look like she had not done her due diligence, or worse, that she was complicit. He formatted the text and aligned the images, then ran through the slide deck one last time. It looked seamless. Sarah, in her arrogance, would not notice a thing until she was mid-pitch. Robert snapped the MacBook shut and stepped away from the kitchen island. Phase 1 was complete. This was just the opening move. He felt zero remorse. The hurricane was still raging inside his chest, but now it had a vector. It was focused. Robert sat in the semi-darkness of his living room, watching the Texas sky bruise into purple and then black. His phone sat on the coffee table, but the idea of calling anyone felt absurd. He had made his move, planting the virus in Sarah's career. Tomorrow, her world would start to burn. But strangely, the thought did not bring the relief he expected. A wave of hollowness and isolation crashed over him, heavier than the humidity outside. Suddenly, the phone buzzed against the wood, startling him. Robert glanced at the screen, expecting Sarah with some excuse, but a different name lit up the display: Zoe. Michael's daughter. She rarely called him, and never this late on a Tuesday. Robert hesitated, staring at the name. What could she possibly want? But his hand moved on autopilot, sliding to answer. Hello. His voice sounded like gravel, like he had not used it in days. On the other end, there was a muffled, slurring voice. Zoe was clearly wasted. Robert tensed up. Zoe, what's wrong? He asked, trying to parse the gibberish. Can you come get me? Uncle Rob, please? Her voice was weak, tripping over the syllables. I see not. I do not want my dad to find out. The words stung. Did Michael have that much of a stranglehold on her that she could not even have a bad night without fearing his wrath? Robert checked his watch. It was well past midnight. The last thing he wanted was to get dragged into someone else's drama, but something in Zoe's tone broke through his numbness. She was just collateral damage in all this, a victim of Michael's ego, just like him. Where are you? He asked, grabbing his keys. She mumbled the address of a dive bar on the east side, just a few blocks from downtown. Robert sighed, hauled himself off the couch, and headed for the door. The whole situation felt surreal. His entire life, he'd been the stand-up guy, the reliable husband, the best friend. Now here he was, driving into the night to rescue his ex-best friend's daughter from a bender, while his own life was radioactive with betrayal. When he pulled up to the curb, East 6th Street was mostly quiet, just a few stragglers stumbling toward rideshares. Zoe was leaning heavily against the brick wall of the bar, looking like that wall was the only thing keeping her upright. Robert walked over, and her eyes, glassy and unfocused, sparked with recognition. Robert. She whispered, sounding surprised he actually showed up. He gently took her by the elbow, stabilizing her, and guided her toward his car. Zoe stumbled in her heels but managed to stay upright. He opened the passenger door and helped her in. The smell of tequila and cheap lime perfume filled the cabin, but as she looked at him, he saw a flash of clarity in her gaze that made him pause. You will not tell my dad, she slurred as he climbed into the driver's seat. I know I'm 23, but he's so psycho about me partying. I just see not deal with another lecture right now. I will not tell him, Robert said shortly, hitting the ignition. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the streetlights rhythmically illuminating the cabin. Then Zoe spoke again. He controls everything. My whole life. He thinks he has God, thinks he knows what's best for me. Her words were messy, but the resentment was razor sharp. And now you know who he really is. Robert felt a strange, twisted kinship with her. They were both victims of Michael's narcissism, just in different ways. Zoe turned her head to rest against the cool glass of the window. Robert thought she might have passed out, but then she spoke again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why are you so angry, Rob?" she asked, without turning her head. Robert gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The words caught in his throat. There was no point in lying. She knew. She knew why he was angry, and in a way, she was part of the betrayal, even if she was innocent. When they pulled up to Michael's driveway, or rather the house Zoe still lived in, she did not move to get out. Her fingers nervously picked at the seatbelt strap, her eyes fixed on the garage door, but her mind seemed miles away. Finally, she turned to face Robert. The look in her eyes was not what he expected. It was not just drunkenness, it was a deep, destructive sadness. "You think revenge is gonna fix it?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Robert did not have an answer. The rage was still a furnace inside him, but Zoe's presence was disarming. She was Michael's flesh and blood, but right now, she looked as lost as he felt. She leaned toward him, her hand drifting out to touch his arm. Robert stiffened but did not pull away. The touch felt heavy, charged with something more than just comfort. It was a transgression. "You want them to pay," she whispered, her fingers tightening slightly on his forearm. "I know a way." Her eyes suddenly lit up with a strange, reckless glint. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. Robert watched, confused, as she swiped open the camera app and turned the lens toward them. She smiled, but it was not a happy smile. "Let us take a picture," she said, her voice teasing but with a dark undertone. Robert froze, not processing her intent. Zoe leaned in, invading his personal space. Her face was inches from his, the scent of alcohol and sweetness overwhelming. She looked straight into his eyes, and for a split second, the air in the car grew thick, electric. Before he could stop her, she snapped the photo. The flash blinded him for a second. Zoe laughed, a low sound that did not reach her eyes. "We can show this to Daddy," she said, staring at the screen with a manic, almost unhinged grin. "He is not going to like what he sees. This could nuke everything." Robert sat motionless, his mind racing. She was weaponizing their proximity, using herself as a grenade to blow up her father's life. He wanted to tell her to stop, that this was crossing a line, but the words would not come. The next morning, Robert woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with alcohol. The previous night with Zoe left a bitter aftertaste, a mix of guilt and the realization of how far off the rails he was sliding. He sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece together the wreckage of the last 24 hours. Zoe, the photo, the sabotage of Sarah's laptop. This was not just him lashing out anymore, it was a calculated demolition. He had barely finished his first cup of coffee when the front door flew open, slamming against the wall. Sarah stormed in, her face twisted in a mask of pure fury. Robert stood up instinctively, bracing himself. "You did this. You." She screamed, marching toward him, her eyes burning with hatred. Robert did not flinch. He watched her approach like one watches a tornado touch down. He knew this was coming, but he had not expected the fallout to be this immediate. "Did what?" he asked coldly, though he knew exactly what. "You tanked my presentation." Sarah shrieked, throwing her designer bag onto the floor. She was hyperventilating. "Do you have any idea what that looked like? I was humiliated. They laughed at me, Robert. The entire board laughed at me." Robert stayed silent, absorbing every detail. She was not just mad, she was broken. Her ego, her precious reputation, it was disintegrating in real time. This was exactly what he wanted. "You think this is funny?" she continued, fists clenched at her sides. "Are you proud of yourself? You think ruining my career is going to make you happy?" He remained stone-faced. He felt hollowed out, his emotional reserves depleted. He looked at her face contorted in selfish agony, and felt nothing. Sarah suddenly stopped, taking a deep, ragged breath. Her voice dropped, becoming quieter but infinitely sharper. You know, Michael and I, it did not start recently. We did not wait for his wife to die to be together. We were doing this way before that. While she was sick. The words were meant to be a dagger to the heart. In any other universe, hearing that his wife and best friend were sleeping together while the friend's wife was dying of cancer would have destroyed him. But Robert just felt a cold, gray fog settle over his brain. This new horror did not change his trajectory, it just confirmed that there was nothing left to save. I knew it, he said quietly, his voice unexpectedly calm. Sarah frowned, her eyes darting frantically across his face, desperate to find a crack in the armor, a glimmer of the husband she could manipulate. But Robert was not the man she had woken up next to for 16 years. He had shed the role of the victim. Now, he was just the spectator watching the controlled demolition of her life. She spun around, snatching her purse off the floor and marching toward the entryway. "You think this is a win?" she spat from the threshold, her voice dripping with venom. "You did not just hurt me, Robert. You destroyed us both. You burned the whole house down." She slammed the front door so hard the frame rattled, leaving him standing alone in the sudden cold silence of the hallway. Robert leaned back against the kitchen island, his fingers tightening around the phone in his pocket. The house was quiet again, but the gears in his head were still turning. He was not finished. Not yet. His hand moved to his phone almost autonomously. He unlocked it and opened the Photos app. There, nestled among the mundane shots of receipts and sunsets, was the picture. Zoe. Her eyeliner was smudged, her eyes glassy and unfocused, staring straight into the lens. She looked deceptively calm in the frame, but Robert knew the radioactive potential lurking behind that pixelated stare. It was the master key to the final act of his revenge. He selected Michael's contact. He did not type a caption.
No explanation, no treats, no contest.
Just the image. He hit send. It was a silent bomb, one he knew would detonate the moment it landed. It took less than 10 minutes for the phone to buzz against the countertop. A text from Michael, "Are you out of your damn mind?" Robert let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He could vividly picture Michael staring at his screen, the blood draining from his face as he realized exactly where his daughter had been and who she was with. His double life was teetering on the edge of a cliff, and he knew it. Robert sat down on his living room couch, feeling the sheer physical weight of the day pressing him into the cushions. He had won the battle, sure. But what was the prize? An hour passed. Maybe 2. The subdivision was quiet, the only sound the occasional swoosh of a car passing on the street outside. Robert stared at his phone screen, waiting for something, though he could not say what. Then it happened. The phone lit up again. Incoming call, Michael. Robert swiped to answer but did not say a word. "You see, not just walk away from this." Michael was screaming, his voice distorted and cracking with panic. "I am going to find you, Robert. You ruined everything. I swear to God I'll..." Robert listened to the incoherent threats for a few seconds, his expression blank, before he simply tapped the red button. End call. None of it mattered anymore. The pieces were in play. He had made his move, and now their lives were sliding inevitably into the abyss. The destruction was self-sustaining now. Late that evening, the walls of the empty house started to close in on him. Robert stepped out into the humid Texas night to clear his head. The air was thick and heavy. He walked for blocks, passing manicured lawns and dark windows, seeing nothing, until his feet carried him back to the only place that made sense. The bar was dimmer now, the late-night crowd thinning out. Sam, the seasoned bartender with the graying beard, looked up as Robert walked in. He gave a subtle nod, the kind that said he knew a man looking for oblivion when he saw one. Robert took his usual stool, and Sam poured him a double of the house bourbon without asking a single question. "Rough day?" Sam finally asked as Robert took the first burning sip. Robert smirked, staring down into the amber liquid. "Rough does not even cover the spread."
Sam nodded silently.
He de-poured drinks for enough broken men to know that sometimes the best service was just keeping the glass full and the advice to himself. Robert sat there for hours, nursing the whiskey, feeling the alcohol slowly blur the sharp edges of his reality. But it could not fill the hollow space in his chest. The mission was accomplished. Sarah was humiliated and likely unemployed. Michael was now living in a personal hell, knowing his daughter had crossed a line he could never unsee. But instead of the rush of victory, Robert felt only a strange, oppressive calm. It was the stillness of a battlefield after the smoke clears, where you realize there are no winners, only survivors standing among the ruins. He downed the last of the bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass. He stood up, left a 20 on the counter, and walked out into the dark, sweltering night without looking back. The fallout was not instantaneous. It was a slow, agonizing burn, the kind that leaves scars on everyone involved. 2 weeks later, Robert stood in the living room of the house on Shady Hollow Drive. The space echoed, stripped of the art, the throw pillows, and the performative warmth Sarah had curated for 16 years. Cardboard boxes were stacked high against the beige walls, marked with Sharpie in Sarah's frantic, jagged handwriting. Outside, a for sale sign from a predatory real estate agency was already planted in the lawn, baking in the relentless Texas heat. Sarah was in the kitchen, wrapping wine glasses in newspaper. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had strutted out of the house just 14 days ago. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her makeup non-existent, and there were dark, bruised circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. The sabotage at the presentation had been more effective than Robert could have possibly calculated. The images he de-spliced into her deck had not just embarrassed her, they had triggered a full-blown compliance investigation. The potential clients, a conservative oil and gas conglomerate from Houston, had walked out of the meeting within 5 minutes. By the time Sarah returned to her office, HR was waiting with a cardboard box and a non-disclosure agreement. In the tight-knit, gossipy world of Austin's corporate consultancy scene, she was radioactive. Gross negligence was the official term. Corporate suicide was the whisper at every happy hour in downtown. "Are you happy now?" Sarah asked, her voice raspy. She did not turn around, just kept aggressively taping a box. "I have a meeting with a recruiter tomorrow for an entry-level sales gig. Commission only. That's what 16 years of building a career is worth now." Robert leaned against the doorframe, sipping an iced tea. He felt a twinge of pity, but it was distant, like watching a stranger stub their toe across the street. "You made your choices, Sarah. You and Michael decided the price of admission a long time ago. I just cashed the check." She spun around, her eyes wet and furious. "We made a mistake, Robert. People make mistakes. You did not have to burn the whole world down." "It was not a mistake," Robert corrected her, his voice level and cold. "It was a lifestyle. You said it yourself, you did not wait for his wife to die. You were living a lie while she was fighting chemo. You do not get to play the victim card now." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to scream, to manipulate, but she closed it again. The fight had drained out of her. She slumped against the counter, sliding down until she was sitting on the linoleum floor, sobbing into her hands. It was the sound of total defeat. Robert watched her for a moment, placed his empty glass on the counter, and walked out to his car. There was nothing left to say. The divorce papers were already filed. Texas was a community property state, so they de-split the assets, but the emotional debt was all hers. He drove toward downtown, the AC blasting against the afternoon humidity. He needed to sign the final papers at his attorney's office on Congress Avenue. As he pulled into the parking garage, he saw a familiar truck. A black Ford F-150, parked crookedly across 2 spots. Robert's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Michael. He parked on the level above and took the elevator down to the lobby, hoping to avoid a scene, but luck was not on his side. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the heat hitting him like a physical blow, Michael pushed off the wall where he'd been waiting. If Sarah looked bad, Michael looked destroyed. He had lost weight, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and he had the unshaven, frantic look of a man who had not slept in a week. The suburban dad veneer was gone, replaced by something desperate and unhinged. "Robert," Michael croaked, stepping into his path. Passers-by in business suits steered clear, sensing the volatility radiating off him. "Get out of my way, Mike," Robert said, not breaking stride. Michael grabbed his arm. It was a weak, pathetic grip. "Zoe's gone. She packed a bag and left the morning after you sent that picture. She blocked my number. She blocked my email. I do not even know where she is." Robert stopped. He looked at his former best friend, the man he grilled steaks with, watched football with, trusted with his life. "She's 23, Michael. She's an adult. Maybe she finally realized she did not need your permission to live her life. You turned her against me, Michael hissed, his face flushing red. You used her. You sick son of a bitch, you used my daughter to get to me. I did not turn her, Robert said, shaking off Michael's hand with a sharp jerk. I just showed you the truth. You were so busy controlling her narrative and sleeping with my wife that you did not notice your own house was made of glass. Zoe hates you because she finally sees you clearly. That's on you. Michael's hands balled into fists. For a second, Robert thought he was going to swing. He almost hoped he would. A physical fight would be easier, simpler than the psychological warfare of the last few weeks. But Michael crumbled. His shoulders dropped, and he looked at the ground, defeated. I lost my job, Michael whispered, staring at the concrete. Word got around about Sarah. About the mess. My partners, they bought me out. Said I was a liability. Character concerns. Austin was a big city, but the circles of influence were small. The scandal of the affair, combined with Sarah's spectacular professional implosion, had created a blast radius that took Michael out too. Reap what you sow, brother, Robert said quietly. He walked past Michael, leaving him standing alone on the scorching pavement of Congress Avenue, a man who had everything and threw it away for a thrill. 6 months later, Robert sat on the balcony of his new apartment. It was a sleek, modern unit in a high-rise overlooking Lady Bird Lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden-orange glow over the water and the paddleboarders drifting below. The air was crisp, a rare, perfect October evening in Texas. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, but it was not for numbing the pain anymore. It was just a drink. The divorce was finalized last week. The house in the suburbs was sold to a young couple from California who overpaid by $50,000. Sarah had moved back to Ohio to live with her sister. Rumor had it she was working as an assistant manager at a retail chain. Michael was still in town, but he was a ghost, divorced by his social circle and estranged from his only child. Robert took a sip and unlocked his phone. He had an Instagram notification. It was from Zoe. It was a photo of her in Colorado, standing on top of a mountain, looking windblown and genuinely happy. No caption, just a peace sign emoji. She had not spoken to Robert since that night in the car, and he had not reached out. They were both survivors of the same wreckage, and sometimes, survivors need to stay apart to heal. But the photo was a signal. She was okay. She was free. Robert liked the photo, then locked his phone and set it face down on the table. He looked out at the skyline, the lights of the city beginning to flicker on against the twilight. For 16 years, he had defined himself by his stability, his marriage, his routine. He had been the anchor. But anchors, by definition, hold you in one place. Now, the anchor was cut. He was drifting, but for the first time in his life, he was steering the ship. He finished his drink, stood up, and went back inside. He had a date in an hour with a woman he'd met at a jazz club on South Congress. A woman who did not know Michael, did not know Sarah, and did not know the old Robert. The nightmare was over. He had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unburned, but forged into something harder, sharper, and finally, undeniably awake. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.